welcome back to the 1875 Lady in Waiting channel. If this is your first visit, we are super thrilled that you have found us. If you're one of our returning guests, well, you'll notice things are just a little different this week. We've got this thing on. Don't sweat it, too bad. Let's just say I've been going really strong for the last few months, and as a result, we've got either some tendonitis or bursitis or something in our elbow. So the doctor wife said it was time to take a break. It was time to take a few days off, and pumping me full of some steroids and whatnot to get the swelling and whatnot to go down. But all in all, we're doing okay, and it's just a little different. So what we thought we would do is, instead of a very busy working video this week, what we would do is we would finally cover the history and the story of our house that we've been hinting at here and there as we've begun the whole process here. I have mentioned on numerous occasions about Irvington being one of the largest historic districts in the state, and what its place meant as far as Indianapolis being the first real, what they called suburban subdivision that was outside of the city limits at the time that it was created in 1870, and everything about that. But its story really goes back about 30 years before that, maybe 25 years or so before that. The gentleman that started the whole thing, their history is pretty amazing. We have to really kind of start when Indiana became a state in 1818. The people that were here at those times, mostly Europeans, at least as far as the white side of the equation is considered. There were lots of natives here long before Indiana ever thought of becoming a state. In fact, Indiana, the literal name from where it comes from, meant from the land of Indians. That was where they adopted the name from and whatnot. So there were always Native Americans here, and were here long before any of us showed up or anything else. I won't say that the history that Indiana has is a good history when it comes to dealing with Native Americans. I will tell you that they don't call it the Trail of Tears for nothing. And I can tell you that a lot of those natives were, kicked off their land, fought off their land, had their land stolen. It's not a good history. All I can do is acknowledge it and say that, this is the truth, and, apologize on behalf of ancestors that I will never know or anything else, but, that is the truth. Our history is long and cumbersome, and it's not pleasant a lot of times, but those are the things that I think in this day and age that we need to at least acknowledge and keep moving forward with. When you start talking about the natives and whatnot, some of the earliest settlers especially in central Indiana, most of those early settlers, they set up on places where they could conduct trade with the natives. To our north, up in Hamilton County, which is the county just north of Indianapolis, there's a historic museum there that is one of those living history museums, and they call it Conner Prairie. Well, it's named after the land, and the land it sits on is after William Conner, who was a farmer in the area, and he was also a trader in the area. He had a trade post set up along the White River. Natives came down the river and up the river and traded with him frequently there. And he ended up with a huge parcel of land. A lot of it is floodplain, but it still was a huge parcel of land that he grew crops on and traded with the natives, and became fairly wealthy. He had a native wife for a while and whatnot until things got more populated, and then he kind of shunned her and took a white wife, and so that he could be more in polite society and whatnot. But one of his friends, as he got older and whatnot, was a gentleman named Eli Lilly. And if you know anything about pharmaceuticals, Eli Lilly is a huge pharmaceutical company, and they're based here in Indianapolis. But original Eli Lilly was very much a naturalist. He wanted to preserve things and those kind of things. He was, he was one that really pushed for preserving William Connor's property and whatnot to be left as it was. Now they've added a few things since then because, like I said, it's a living history museum now, but his original house is still on the property and they've preserved it, and you can go and take museum tours and things through it, and you can go to Connor Prairie and enjoy a great day, and they transport you back in time to 1865 or 1870 or whenever it is. They have different segments, different little villages, so it's kind of really interesting. But those are the kind of people that set up where our story's kind of going. Indianapolis itself was not the first capital of the state. The first capital of the state was down south, down in Corydon. That's real near the Ohio River, down around Louisville and Madison and that kind of area down there. But a group of people got together, a group of legislators got together and wanted to move this capital to a more central location in the state. Granted, they also owned a lot of the land, so that was part of their part of their push, but they wanted it to be centralized. One of those people was John McCormick, who there's also in the state now is a place called McCormick's Creek. It's a state park. It's he had a cabin along the river, and that was part of that's part of his land got bought and sold, and that's why they moved Indianapolis to there. I can go on and on and on about some of this stuff, because if you hadn't figured it out, I am a true history buff, and the history part of my story here is probably as interesting to me as preserving the house and building the house, and so I like to try to tie all the pieces together. But Irvington, where it got platted, there were several people involved in that scenario. We talked about the National Road splits Irvington in half. The National Road, I think Congress approved all that in the mid-1820s. It took a few years to get started. By the time it got to Indianapolis, moving through Indiana, it got to what was Richmond, which technically Centerville was the county capital on the far east of Indiana, but Richmond became the biggest city in the area because it had the National Road going through it, and B, it had railroads going through it. So Richmond became a logical, that was the place that grew up. So from Richmond to Indianapolis, it's not a big distance. It's about 50, 60 miles. But in the mid 1800s, that was quite a distance. I mean, that's more than some people traveled in their whole life. But along the way, there was another place called Brookville, and then another place called Cumberland, and then you get into Indianapolis. But and all these were train stops, and they were all on the National Road, and so each one of them served a purpose at some point in time. They were a stopping point, they were a waypoint, they were a place that had inns or taverns, or they were places that had train depots so you could drop off goods and services or pick up goods, and so these are the things that are kind of in tune when we start talking about Irvington. I've mentioned before that Irvington is literally about 5 miles from downtown Indianapolis at the heart of the circle. Well, Cumberland is about 5 miles further east. So Cumberland to Indianapolis was about 10 miles. So when they started talking about this property that became Irvington, that was just about halfway in between the two. And that was really important. I mean, that was considered, at the time they considered a 6-mile horse ride to be a day's journey. Even to this day, we have townships and assessors and all these kind of things. And all of our townships, the way that the state's platted out, all these townships are basically roughly 6 miles wide. And that was so that the township, you could go from whoever the assessor was, or the clerk, or the auditor, or whoever it was that was the local politician of the township, could travel the entire township in one day. Wherever they lived at in the township, and early on that was frequently a requirement. You had to live in the township. But you could travel from one side of the township to the other. You could get to anywhere in that township in one day. You may not make it back, but you could make it to wherever your duties required you to be in that one day. Irvington was no different. By splitting it right there, you could put, we are technically in Warren Township. So Center Townships was downtown Indianapolis. At that time, Indianapolis was literally the 1 mile square. That was what they referred to it. The city of Indianapolis, in its original plat, it's 1 mile square. And to this day, we have West Street, East Street, North Street, South Street, and those are the original boundaries of what was Indianapolis. It was 1 mile square. With what later became the Soldiers and Sailors Monument at the circle, as we call it, at the center of it. All the streets radiated from that center in like spokes. You have east, west, north, south streets, and then you have cross streets that run diagonally. And that was the way that the city was originally platted out and laid out for the state capital. When they first got together and they started putting together the actual plat, there are several people that were involved. There were the Sandusky's, the Fullens, the Wilsons, the Poggs. These were all people who owned farms in this area. Another big name was Ellenberger. To this day, in 2021, we have in our historic district, we have a huge park. It's called Ellenberger Park. It is part of the only part of their original farm that remains. The plat was originally platted in 1870, and by 1873 they had enough signatures and enough voters and enough residents that they could incorporate to become a town. This is the kind of way Indiana has always done things. There's a lot of little towns inside of Indianapolis now. Indianapolis in 2021 extends for all of Marion County, and we cover the entire county. And that happened in the 1970s when then Mayor Richard Lugar, who was a longtime senator from Indiana, he was the mayor of Indianapolis, and one of the things that he did was just annex all of Marion County and call it Indianapolis. But there are a lot of little towns inside of Indianapolis, inside that umbrella. There's one little town that I'm pretty certain you've heard of. It's called Speedway. It's where the Indianapolis 500s run every year. There's a great big track there with about 400,000 people every year, except during COVID years. But yeah, that was a little town that was on the west side of Indianapolis. It still sits in Marion County. It sits about the same distance to the west of downtown Indianapolis as we do to the east. But there's a lot of these little towns. There was, a little town of Irvington. There was the little town of West Indianapolis that was just on the other side of White River. There was the little town of Hawville. There was a little town of Beech Grove. There's a little town called Lawrence. There's a lot of these little towns that sprang up over 100 and some years, and they're now all just little entities inside the greater umbrella of Indianapolis. But that's what gets us to Irvington. That's the point about Irvington, is that it was the true first one. Halfway between Indianapolis and Cumberland, was Irvington, and one of the main reasons why. There were several reasons, but the two big reasons or three big reasons, I guess you could say, is one, because they were halfway between Cumberland and Indianapolis. Two, they sat on the National Road, which was, huge. And thirdly, there were two major railroads that, one of them now is a walking trail. We call it the Pennsy Trail. It became the Pennsylvania Railroad up until it was finally, Pennsylvania Railroad shut down, and that became abandoned for many years, but now it's called the Pennsy Trail, and people hike on it and walk on it and bike on it, and It now extends several miles to the east. And the other is a railroad. It had many different names, but probably the name that most people will recognize it as is because it became known as the B&O, Baltimore and Ohio. I mean, that's, if you've ever played Monopoly, the B&O Railroad, that was a part of that line. They had acquired, they acquired several different lines and whatnot. It technically was what they called a Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Terre Haute, which, because Terre Haute's on the far west of Indianapolis, but there was a rail line that came from Cincinnati to Indianapolis, and it stopped at some of these other locations like Brookville and whatnot along the way. But both of those railroads are within the Irvington district, the Irvington Plat. So when we get to talking about our house and Irvington and whatnot, we have to kind of look at the groundwork, the framework on which it was started in. And that framework, that foundation, really, we have to go back about 30 years. In fact, we have to go back to the late 1840s. I've said on a couple of different times now that, there was a college here. Well, this college didn't originate in Irvington. That is, Irvington, it being in Irvington was a byproduct of Irvington being established. But the college itself, it began more in the 1840s. And in fact, I'm gonna have to cheat here a little bit and put some of these on so I can read some of my notes. But there was basically a conglomeration of churches across the state. In fact, my notes say that here there was about 300 churches and nearly 20,000 regular members, congregational worshipers, however you want to look at it. They said they had roughly, due to some of the publications, there was about 130 preachers, but most of these preachers at that time were what we would call traveling ministers. They were lay ministers that went from church to church, town to town, whatever, may spend a few weeks, months, whatever in a place, but they weren't established spending long periods of time in a central, one location. They would have moved around quite a bit. The actual denomination, as we call them, Christian churches, but the actual denomination in Indiana, it came about through mergers of some dissident factions. I'm going to say this real carefully here. I've always been amazed at the number of churches that have grown up and sprung up and created their own entity and unity out of things like disagreements and arguments and we don't like you, you don't like us, we have different, we don't believe you're doing it right, we don't believe you're doing, and they all split hairs and split churches. Basically it boils down to, as I studied a lot of history, it boiled down to there was the Orthodox Church that was what would have been considered the original church. They split, creating the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, and then there was another split between the Catholic Church and now what is the Protestant Church. And all those layers of whatever the churches are at this point in time, whether it's Lutheran, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, on and on and on, Mormon, Jehovah's Witness, they are all a branch off of that same tree. And it's a massive tree with lots and lots of branches and leaves. But, the things we see today aren't any different than the things that were going on 150 years ago. In fact, my notes here say, the denomination began in Indiana through the merging of dissident factions of regular, free will, and German Baptist, or drunkard, I don't know what that is, congregations into what was then known as the Campbell movement, which had its beginnings in Western Virginia and Northern Ohio, and the Stone movement, which had its origin primarily with former Presbyterian congregations in Kentucky. Alexander Campbell, Barton W. Stone had similar objectives and a common program, and both groups made their formal declaration of union in Lexington, Kentucky in 1832. these two frontier religious bodies should join forces in Indiana. Made sense. One group preferred the name Disciples of Christ, while both groups basically took on the name of Christian churches. So there's a lot of history here. There's a lot to unfold, but this is the background on which things are developing. And I'm telling you this because we're getting to what ties into our story into a tragedy. Part of this whole organization was that they got together, and the ideal for getting this together and putting this assembly together and moving forward was they wanted to create a college. That was, they wanted to create a place of higher learning. A lot of the men that we're going to talk about here, trust me, I'm absolutely 100% guaranteed that there were women involved. They don't get a lot of credit, although some of their wives get mentioned as being, a push behind something else. One of the things that is really cool about the university as we go forward is it does become the first university in America that creates and funds a full-time faculty position that is chaired by a female. This is the 1860s, 1870s, and this is huge. This is big news. This is something that had never occurred before, and they make most of the people that that we're referring to, most of them were anti-slavery and pro-suffrage. Oh, okay, that's it's a little different when you start studying some of the stuff that you find out that that is a little different. That's not some of the stuff. Some of the arguments are the same arguments I've heard over my lifetime in different segments, but you do find out that there are some people that that there's a lot of things that there's a lot of balls in the air. There's a lot of juggling going on, and there's a lot of different groups that come together and meet together. But the beginning of all this then is that the Indiana Christian Home Missionary Society was created in 1849, and its goal was to begin a study, a formation, a whatever, to can we build a university. Not only just build one, but you had to fund it. You had to fund not only the university, you had to fund the faculty, you had to fund the buildings. Then you had to get the students, and a lot of times you were funding the students even to come because, they may not have the money to attend in anything. But this was their goal. This is what they wanted to do. And this wasn't their first attempt. In fact, some of these men had already worked on getting different things established. There was the Wayne County Seminary in Centerville. There was the Ladoga Academy in Ladoga, which is just west of Indianapolis here, maybe 25 miles or so. You had Howard College up in Howard County, which is Kokomo area. You had Fairview Academy, which is in Fairview, Indiana. Fairview, Indiana, home of James Dean. I mean, so you kind of all these places, these little burbs, these little places in town are in Indiana. These little towns, they keep popping back up and over the history, and they may be known for many different things. So the first thing that they did was the three of these. They set up a committee, and then they set up a committee. Does this not sound like today as well? You got to have a committee to find out if we can have a meeting to set up. That nothing's changed. But these three men were appointed to set up a committee of 5 people to basically figure out, can we, should we, how do we kind of do this? And there were 5 people. There was an Elijah Goodwin of Bloomington, a Milton B. Hopkins, he's going to come back, hang on to that name, of Frankfort, Thomas Conley of Connorsville, Love Jameson, and Ovid Butler of Indianapolis. Remember that last name. Hang on to it. They met they went through this whole thing. They started doing the college matter, and they started going before all the congregations and basically asking them, "Hey, how do you feel about this?" I mean, you got 20,000 people. You're trying to get their opinions. You have 20,000 people. You've got 300 churches. You're going to be working hard to figure out, you know, can we do this? How should we do this? So one of the first things that they did, and one of the first things that was on the ballot, so to speak, was, can we do this? Yes, we can do this. That was pretty much that's, should we? Yes, we definitely want to. And then lastly, it was where. There was numerous places proposed. In this 1840s, late 1840s, early 1850s, there are a handful of colleges in Indiana at this point in time. Out west in Crawfordsville, we have Wabash College that was founded in 1838. That's my son's alma mater. It's a great school. It's a liberal arts school. It's a men's only school. It's one of the few left in the whole country at this point in time. Lew Wallace, if you've ever seen Ben-Hur, read the book, Lew Wallace went to Wabash. In fact, when we get to John Hopkins and we start talking about the guy that built my house, he also goes to Wabash. There's a lot of history in this. There is Hanover College down in Madison, Indiana, which is along the Ohio River. In fact, those two colleges, when you read about their history, Hanover was started and began by what they called the old Presbyterians, and Wabash was started and began by what they called the new Presbyterians. Don't ask me the difference. I have been trying to figure it out, and so far I cannot figure it out. But that's just, there you go. At this point in time, Indiana University, the Indiana University is down in Bloomington. It's just been started. It has a full-time staff and like no students. This is where we are. Purdue University has been started, and there's not a whole lot but there is some, and the majority of them are tied to religious organizations or denominations or congregations of some sort. Methodist, Presbyterian, Luther's, something along those lines. So the religious end of this is that these are the people who initiated this and got a lot of these schools started. The resolution that they stated was that a Northwestern Christian University be founded at Indianapolis as soon as sufficient amount of funds can be raised to commence it, and that a committee of 7 be appointed by this meeting to take the preliminary steps in reference to the funding and endowment of such an institution. So this took them a couple of years right there. But here's where our story really starts taking on water, so to speak. One of the people that they appoint to this committee after this resolution is passed is a gentleman by the name of John O'Kane. Now, I told you a couple of names to remember earlier. Milton Hopkins. Milton Hopkins he's pretty special to our story. Milton Hopkins would be one Mr. John Hopkins' father. But Milton is he's on this board, he's on this group of people that is starting the Northwest Christian College. And one of the people that get us appointed now is John O'Kane. Now, John O'Kane is also a traveling minister, and he's great friends with one Milton. So you see how this is starting great. In fact, my builder of my house, his name is John O'Kane Hopkins. So we have John O'Kane as one of the people that gets appointed to this committee, Milton Hopkins, who's his father, and they're great friends. They've known each other for years, and so this is how John gets named. He gets named John O'Kane Hopkins. It's his friend. He names one of his sons after his friend, and that gentleman ends up becoming the builder of our house. So despite this crazy thing, one thing I did want to talk about is my shirt here. salvaged, save the trees. If you get a chance, this is one of the shirts that I got off of another YouTube site. It's called the 1806 Stone House. Lucas has been working on his 200 plus year old house there for, God, what, 4 or 5 years now. I found his YouTube channel 3 years ago, I think it was. But if you want to see one man's dedication to preserving something for him and his family has been, I highly recommend his channel. Go check it out. I think he's got over 200 episodes now, and you know, he also has 3 small children, which I don't have. I'm thankful for that these days. I'm well beyond those times. But you know, so Sarah, his wife, helps him when she can. As the children have gotten a little older here, she's able to do a little more. In fact, I think when he starts, he only has 2 children, but now he has 3, and I think that one has gotten to be a couple years old now. So, but you know, buy a T-shirt, watch his videos. You'll enjoy them.